Chapter 4. The Bad Guys Win. The Oglers had sent foot soldiers onto the ship and they were now mounting a full-scale attack. Katie tried her finger thingy, but no use. I could feel the god ship shaking. "There," said one of the Oglers, this time staring at the gem in my hand. That's when I saw the full extent of Katie's power and felt the surge of the multiverse. She was about to blast the Oglers, and then she must have decided better of it and made a portal so as not to blast us out of the ship's hull. I heard the familiar radio static of Roswell, New Mexico. It was just barely perceivable over the sound of the Oglers' footsteps. "Come on, guys, I'm in here," Katie said as I felt the desert sun on my face, so different from the cold harshness of space. That's when I jumped through the portal to the halfway house, followed closely by a wounded Katie. It had closed behind me, but not before a shot was fired off, hitting Katie sideways. It had penetrated her magical shield. I could tell her shoulder was burning. She was bleeding pretty badly. "We've got to get her to a doctor," I replied. "Does anybody know where the hospital is located in reference to the halfway house?" "I do," said Pantheon. "I dated a cute Earth girl once. She was a nurse. She tasted nice." "What?" "Ignore him," replied Daisy, trying to comfort Katie as she rolled her eyes at Pantheon. Katie's brow was sweating, and her eyes were rolling back in her head. They were white. As I entered Lovelace Regional Hospital, Katie had passed out again. The ER nurses rushed to her side and took her from me. I hadn't seen my sister in 5 years, and now she was dying in my arms. I was soaked in blood. Later that evening, I went up to her room after surgery. She looked fine. I hadn't bothered to call Mom and Dad. But it wasn't the best relationship after all. I mean, my dad was busy breeding Maine Coons, and he had other hobbies. My mom was a total, well, you understand. I mean, who locks their son in a psych ward at 11 years old? I mean, obviously I still couldn't remember what I'd done, but I knew it couldn't be that bad, right? She was still out cold, but mostly from painkillers. When she finally did open her eyes, she smiled a goofy drug-induced smile. "Ed, is that you? I thought you went to New Mexico to be an alien hunter. You had your guitar so you'd never run out of cash, and you could always play for me underneath the stars." "Where's Mom? Where's Dad?" she asked sleepily. "They're in the waiting room," I lied. "Shh. Sleep, rest, you'll need it." I hadn't lied from what Mama Ritz and Candelian were saying. The Oglers had invaded Earth, and they weren't about to stop. They needed the power the Archipelago Formula provided. They could breed an infinite number of themselves in a second and raise their numbers if they had it. I held the stone object close to my heart. "We have to use the formula first," replied Doc. "Well, I've got a translator back in Cabo," I replied, "but I don't think he can read this." "Man, what are we going to use the formula on once we can access it?" asked Roscoe. Daisy chimed in, "Something good. Better be, because we went through hell trying to find this thing." "I could use some more girlfriends," replied Pantheon. "That's it," replied Roscoe. "Always thinking with your stomach. You know, you are so sexist. It's not even like you have parts. Why only kill females?" Pantheon smiled. "They taste better." He licked his lips, too. Daisy made a throw-up motion. Doc kept the peace. We all know that Pantheon has disgusting habits. It's well documented. No, I think we should draw on it. Anyone for a game of spears and sticks? Doc held out his hand and there was a holographic flash of light and several floating objects appeared in the air. I get the spears, replied Roscoe. And the rest of us get the sticks, said Daisy unenthusiastically. As everyone played, huddled over in the corner, I stood back with Katie. She'd be up and able to go in a few hours, and then we needed to leave before people really started asking questions, or the oglers got hold of us, whichever one came first. Suddenly I felt my skin prickle. I knew that feeling. I had this weird sense of deja vu. Then I looked up to see a spider the size of my torso climbing on the ceiling. It leapt at me, and I rolled, pulling the phaser. Guys, we've got company. Doctors at 5 o'clock, Roscoe. Roscoe transformed into a Gailac and started to spray acid vomit. He was covered in the wool that was like a shag rug, but he blew out the walls of the room. Pantheon created a vortex and pulled a sword from his subconscious mind down in the deep. Daisy bent floor tiles and levitated them in midair like a shield, and she created a psychic burst. As the tiles hit the doctors, Roscoe's spray blinded them. Their sharp teeth was extremely vile looking. They were tracker beasts used by the Autome. Pantheon began chopping off heads and swallowing bodies whole. It was actually pretty disgusting. Doc pulled out an instrument and the air froze. It was a time bomb. Relativity always was a beautiful thing. The figures in the room all moved in slow motion, except Doc, who was killing multiple doctors. Then the time bomb ceased, and the whole blowout room was covered in blood oozing out. Roscoe transformed back into a little Brazilian boy. He always was a cute kid. I never could mediate with the dead. That was just a figment of my subconscious. As the Autome bounty hunters came up the hallway, I heard Katie wake up. She had been asleep this whole time. What, Ed? What's going on? Am I dreaming? Said Katie, all drugged up. We could really use a portal right now, sis, I said with a sense of urgency, fighting them off with my phaser out. Yeah, I'll get right on that, she said with a slight slur. Come on, I thought. My phaser was reloading. F it. I chucked it off the outside of the hospital building. It was time to use my gifts. The Autome must have been hired by the damn oglers. Always troublemakers. I felt the wind rush around me. It was slow at first, and then it started to build. It got stronger as time went on. Then I could feel the lightning strikes and my eyes turned to hazel blue, and I began to levitate off the ground. Then the hospital room, or what was left of it, began to melt and I was surrounded by molten plasma. Yeah, shit got for reals. I shot the hot, sticky ceramic goo at the Autome bounty hunters as they fired hand grenades, but they bounced off. It was child's play. I hadn't been powerful enough to use this yet because the ogler had ogled me so bad, but I was able to reach full strength now. The captain of the Autome was ripped in half and turned into ash, and the others soon followed suit. Then the wind calmed down and I was finally back. The kid with cancer in the next room over had his mouth open. I smiled at him with blue flashing teeth. What's up? I said coolly. The kid's mom was in the corner of his room, held against the wall. She reached for her son and rushed into the hallway to head down the stairs. We stopped by the cafeteria as we left the hospital. It was a nice hospital, was being the operative word. I knew a guy in Haiti who could fix it up real nice. I left my card. That's when the suits finally decided to show. I didn't have enough juice from the multiverse, and Sis was not doing so hot. I tried to open a portal, but I felt weak and the formula levitated from my hand. The Oglers had it. That's when I got the portal open and I let us through. Everybody was in rough shape. Luckily, we were all alive. They got it, I heaved. They got the formula, replied Candelian. It will take an army of space rangers to get that back. Not if you know where they're headed, I replied. They need a translator just like us. And there's only one guy who works as a translator on ancient and missing texts in the whole multiverse that's qualified. Who? Asked Doc. James Eisenhower, I replied. Your dad? Asked Roscoe. Mama Ritz chimed in with her head spinning. I thought he bred Maine Coons in Alaska. What's he know about translating? He's an M, I replied. Retired M. We were standing somewhere in a field outside Seattle. We had lost the Godship and we lost the Archipelago Formula. And we were down for the count. We would have to hitch a ride through Canada. We finally found a bus down a side road that was parked and unused. We may have borrowed it for the time being. I knew how to hotwire it. I'd spent some time in juvenile before the psych ward. I still couldn't remember what for. It was why I finally left home. The fear and resentment was terrifying to live with. Katie was asleep. She looked like she was having a bad dream. I wondered what had happened to my baby sister after those 5 years. She had certainly grown into her powers since then. Mine came at a much younger age, but my father suppressed it in me until I ran away as a teenager. When we hit the road, it was nice and quiet with the patter of rain. Time passed differently in different parts of the multiverse, so I had no idea what year it was, but I assumed that my folks were still alive and kicking. Your guess is as good as mine. When we hit the Canadian-American border, it was dark, the stars were out, and I could see the aurora in the sky. I wondered how often I looked at it as a child, hoping to go there. You know how Canadians are. They never wondered much of anything. I had some fake passports on me from my coat pocket, and so we were able to cross unscathed. Told them we were visiting tourists. We had a lively conversation. On our way up through British Columbia and then the Yukon, it was a pretty silent trip. I mean, we played games, but this time the bad guys had won for once. Space Rangers 0. We had won the battle, but they had won the war. Hopefully, we could save the multiverse one last time. We did stop once or twice. One time we stopped at the Nass River Bridge so I could pee, and this old lady thought I was committing suicide. Funny story. When I turned around, she blushed and just got back in her vehicle. I kind of looked like a hobo anyways, so I'm not sure if she was just also like, what the fuck. We were just outside of Anchorage when my memory came back fully. It was something Katie said to me. She goes, do you remember Chugach State Park? We were going through there and it just so happened I did. If you're not familiar with Chugach, it's a park located just outside Anchorage. We went there when I was 11 with my cousin and a neighbor kid. It was nice. We vacationed there in the summertime. Crisp, cool, clean air. So anyways, I had a fit. I couldn't control my powers. I almost got Katie too. She was too young to understand what was happening. I created a diameter of destruction that killed both of them. It wasn't until Dad calmed me down that I felt I was okay. But he was afraid of me. Him and Mom both. He sent me not to an asylum, but this place for M's. It was a special place where they could contain your powers until you learned to use them correctly. If you learned to use them correctly, that was oh that was the first time and only time I saw Dad use his powers. We never talked about much of anything after I came back from the hospital in Los Angeles. It was the closest anywhere around. I felt like a freak. Nobody wanted me, and I was always under his power. If I stepped out of line, I knew what was waiting for me. As the bus turned into Anchorage, I could start to see the suits. The oglers were everywhere. We each put on disguises. They'd be looking for us, and they'd have the local authorities on their side. We looked rough. I hadn't shaved in forever or showered. Roscoe now had this compulsive twitch where he would have to touch things. Pantheon had a scar that spanned his face. Daisy was currently chain smoking. Doc was having trouble talking to himself. Mama Ritz was anxiety prone. Candlian had this thing where he would compulsively bet Roscoe on nearly everything, and Katie, well, she still was healing from the surgery, but luckily everything seemed fine with her shoulder. As we got to the house, we turned off the headlights and stepped onto the front pavement. My dad's Chevelle was sitting outside, the one that I had learned to drive as a kid. Normally he had it in the garage. I looked in through the window. I told the others to duck and cover as an ogler walked out of the house, letting a Maine Coon out into the field. They always returned for food. Dad loved letting them free range. He said the ones that survive are the best. Dad was sitting at an old drafting table. He was chained to it, and Mom was nowhere to be found. Maybe they had done the old witch in. Dad, I whispered, but he couldn't hear me. I said it louder. Dad! This time he heard me. His voice sounded strained, like they had beaten him down pretty badly. Ed? Ed, is that you? Oh, thank God. Careful, they might see you, he said in a whisper. The whole house was dark and the heat was off. When I got closer, I could see the bruised face of a man who had fallen from grace. The tears in his eyes were real and he looked frail. Katie, he asked further. Yeah, Dad, replied Katie. He tried to get up to hug us, but the chains were holding him down. Doc went to work soldering them off. Where's Mom? Asked Katie. Outside in the shed, he replied. Do you have the formula, Dad? I asked. No, he replied. They have it in a secret location. They won't tell me where it is. I've been working with pictures of it. Done, came Doc's semi-jovial tone. Mama Ritz smiled and held his hand. We've heard so much about you, Papa. Not all of it good, but there's no time. We gotta get the cat in the bag. Oh! Mama Ritz felt a Maine Coon brush up against her. It was a rather large male one. Yes, I suppose we do, replied Dad assuredly. He picked up the portfolio of photographs of the formula, and we began to walk out the door. That's when we caught one of them. He was tall and rather lanky. Must have been 6'4". He was big for a normal ogler. He must have been high-ranking. Get down, I said as the agent pulled a weapon. Then the house blew up. I mean, literally, the whole southern wall on fire. And we hadn't a clue until I saw Mom standing there holding a phaser. Maybe I misjudged her. That's my girl, replied Dad honestly. He stepped over the body of the ogler and walked over to embrace my mom. Katie replied jealously, I thought I was your girl. Then Dad opened a portal and we all jumped in. We landed in Los Angeles. I remember the street. It was the asylum. I went to as a kid. It seemed less foreboding. Next to it was a halfway house for teen M's, without parents mostly. It was a tall building, totally invisible to the outside world. As we stepped into the familiar goo of the shield, the welcomer welcomed us. We must have looked ragged. I think I left it here last time I checked, replied Dad. Then he pulled the tarp off a rather old-looking ship. It was one of the sleekest ships I had ever seen. He had to levitate the tarp off, obviously, because he couldn't do it in one throw. The guns were totally badass. Does anybody else have the ability to pilot? I'm a little weak from the kidnapping, replied Dad. Mama Ritz raised her hand. Boy, you can count on me. Katie quipped, Didn't you crash last time I was with you? Mama Ritz smiled. Girl, butterflies and roses. You'll understand when you get older. Mama Ritz always drives. How are we going to get the formula back? Asked Katie. Oh, I think your brother can handle that one, replied Dad. Thanks, I smiled. No, thank you. Without you, I wouldn't be alive. They would have ogled me for sure, replied Dad. I hear you saved a race of very intelligent rutabagas, replied Dad. Word travels fast. I smiled, not fast enough. When we got on the ship, Dad looked at the portfolio the oglers had given him. Can you translate it? I asked. No, he replied, but your mother might know of somebody who can. She used to be a space ranger back in a time zone that no longer exists. She saved an entire species of Thatchians. They also don't exist anymore. The multiverse is very strange. I'll tell you where to go, Mama Ritz, said Mom. I hadn't seen her this wild and free. Usually she just had this tone that I couldn't stand. Now she had her hair back. I guess I grew up and learned that my parents weren't so bad after all. Where to, Dollface? Asked Mama Ritz. The Prosper System, replied Mom. Well, here we go, replied Mama Ritz. Lightspeed, hang on to your space panties.